America's Civil War, the clash of North and South, the Union versus the Confederacy. Today, many Americans proudly trace their ancestors back to the famous heroes from both sides, like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman. But there are other names rarely heard except by those related by blood.
My family has been in every war since the Revolution.
Ely Parker, Stan Watie, Henry Berry Lowry. Though largely forgotten today, more than 20,000 Native Americans fought in the Civil War.
Native Americans, both enlisted and officers, were in the trenches at every major battle.
They would be recruited by both the North and the South.
They were surrounded by two hostile camps that were pulling at their existence.
This is their untold story. The truth behind a war not of blue and gray, but of blue, gray, and the men both sides called red. It is the spring of 1861. The first shots have been fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, and the federal troops that occupied the fort have been taken by the Confederacy. Newly elected President Abraham Lincoln looks to the northern states to provide a 75,000-man militia. The call goes out for volunteers. They are only asked to serve a 3-month stint, the time the North estimates will be needed to put down the insurrection. In Albany, New York, Ely Parker, a civil engineer who has been working for the government, attempts to answer Lincoln's call. Many of his co-workers have already enlisted. Because of their skills, most are immediately given officer commissions. But Parker comes away empty-handed. Though he has skills, education, and experience in the New York militia, he is also a member of the Tonawanda Seneca Indian Nation, where he serves as a high-ranking sachem, or chief.
In the early part of the war, until May of 1862, there was no Native American allowed into a regiment in Western New York. There was racial discrimination reflected in the recruiting office, and also there was confusion because Native Americans weren't citizens. And the question is whether you could enlist non-citizen Native Americans into regiments.
Parker appeals the decision to Secretary of State William Seward, to no avail. This, he is told, is a white man's war. But Parker is determined. He continues to press his case and recruits some powerful friends to lobby on his behalf, including one he met several years before.
He served as an assistant engineer on the Genesee Valley Canal, and that experience brought him eventually to Galena, Illinois.
Became fast friends with a worker in a harness store named Ulysses S. Grant.
The two men, both with military backgrounds, also share a common frustration. Though Grant is a West Point graduate and a veteran of the Mexican War, his career has stalled, and he is reduced to working at his parents' store. Parker, who had been refused entry to the New York bar because of his race, can sympathize.
He was an engineer, he was a lawyer, although not allowed to practice that.
Their friendship is cemented when Parker comes to Grant's aid during a fight in a local tavern. Back to back, they take on all comers. It is a gesture that Grant, a man known for his loyalty, will never forget.
And that friendship that he made in the 1850s was to change his life forever.
After the Civil War restarts his military career, Grant helps his old friend obtain a captain's commission, then makes a place for Parker on his own military staff.
When Grant is appointed to the head of the Army of the Potomac in March of 1864, he takes Ely Parker with him. He recruits Parker to become his military secretary, and he serves in that role through the end of the war.
Ely is at his side every moment, including the battles themselves. Grant's staff would stay behind to do things, and Ely be right at Grant's side in those battles.
By the end of 1863, Ely Parker was only one of many Native Americans in the field. The Union has come to realize, after being routed at Bull Run in Manassas, Virginia during the summer of 1861, that this will be no short-term war. Recruits will be needed for years, not months, as was once hoped, and Northern recruiting practices have changed accordingly.
At the beginning of the Civil War, it was primarily a white man's war. White men went to the colors, signed up, and there was no need for Native Americans. As the war continued, it became a butcher shop's list. Many men were being killed, they were sent home, they were sick, they were dying by the thousands. And many people were needed now. Any man who could carry a musket was needed. And that's when the Native Americans were allowed to come into the ranks.
The massive casualties created a need for a population that the government until now had had little use for.
From the moment the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock, according to the whites, there was an Indian problem. This became the official business of Congress in 1830 when they passed the Indian Removal Act. This allowed them to take eastern tribes from their traditional homelands that they had perhaps been on for centuries, and they could move them to the unceded lands in the West.
For decades, as the white population moved westward, the government pushed Native Americans to either assimilate or leave. By the start of the war, some 90,000 native peoples had relocated to what is now Oklahoma. East of the Mississippi, there are only pockets of Native Americans left living on the fringes of white society in New York, Michigan, and the South. In the West, however, there is open warfare, as the indigenous tribes clash with the whites, drawn by the California Gold Rush and the opening of the Oregon Trail.
There were uprisings all throughout the West, in California, Arizona, Utah, and it would take the Army 20 more years to get the West under control.
But the tribes of the East are now seen as potential allies. Though each side will use propaganda criticizing the other for employing savages in battle, both North and South offer Native Americans higher and higher bounties to sign up.
The Indians know they will get a $50 federal bounty, they will get a $25 state bounty, and that they will be paid $13 a month like every regular soldier in the regiment. The money was a big incentive.
Other promises are made or implied. There may be rewards and recognition after the war, if they join the winning side.
Some, like the Cherokees, saw the advantages of joining the Confederacy based on the fact that the Confederacy offered a position within the Confederate Congress in Richmond, the idea that they could be spokespersons in the Confederate Congress.
Many Native Americans decided to join the Union Army to save the lands that they still possessed in the North. And they figured if they joined the Army, they would then have a stake in their country, and their country would recognize that.
At least 20,000 Native Americans respond to these overtures, though some estimates put the number closer to 30,000. It is difficult today to single out Native Americans on the surviving roster